Hi, my name is Batu Yolson, and this is my final project for the Trial by Media class. I will start by introducing investigative journalism. Investigative journalism is a branch of journalism where reporters perform in-depth investigation on a story that may uncover corruption, evaluate government policies, or draw attention to social, economic, political, or cultural issues. Investigative journalists expose public matters that are deliberately or accidentally concealed. Since they dive deep into an issue on a single topic, the research may take a long time and may require resources. While conventional reporters rely on materials provided by the government, non-government organizations, or other agencies, investigative reporters must gather materials by their own initiative. A well-known example is the Boston Globe's Spotlight team that revealed widespread wrongdoing in the American Roman Catholic Church in 2002. The team received the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for their work. The podcast Serial is an excellent example of investigative journalism. It was a spin-off of NPR's This American Life, co-produced by Sarah Koenig and Julie Snyder. Season 1 covers the murder of Hae Min Lee, a 17-year-old female student at a high school in Baltimore, Maryland in 1999. Season 2 investigated the case of an American soldier who was held as a hostage by the Taliban for 5 years and charged with desertion. Season 3 explored legal cases at the Justice Center complex in Cleveland, Ohio. As an example, in Season 1, after 15 years of murder, Koenig went back and performed an in-depth investigation on the facts, witnesses, and the trial. She spoke to witnesses and people who knew the victim and the suspect, called an expert attorney and former detective to evaluate the validity of the police investigation, looked in depth at the stakes facts and evidences, knocked on Jay's door to have an interview, found blueprints of the Best Buy to determine whether there was a payphone. She drove from the school to Best Buy and then to Patapsco State Park to evaluate Jay's statement regarding what happened on the afternoon of January 13th. And she researched the possibility of a butt dial call to AT&T. After Serial, many other media platforms followed the case. Most recently, HBO created a documentary called The Case Against Adnan Syed. All the new exposure by the media after his conviction helped Syed to have a new trial. I will provide more details about the case later in the presentation. Now I'm going to talk about the impact of podcasts in covering criminal cases such as Syed's compared to a more traditional way, such as television news stories, documentaries, and articles. Although the traditional media, such as television and radio, can potentially reach many more people, there are several advantages of podcasts over the traditional platforms in covering such criminal cases. One advantage is its flexibility. People can play them anywhere at any time, walking, jogging, driving, and they can start from the beginning of the story. They can replay, go back and forward to pay attention to details. There's no time or space constraint. They can include many witnesses, experts, details, etc. Television, radio, and newspapers all have a time and space limitation. Another advantage is its accessibility. Podcast episodes can be downloaded to most smartphones or computers, and most people have at least one of them. Podcasts also have longevity. They can have a long shelf life where people can listen to them many years after posting. Typically, interest in a specific podcast may take time, but may snowball like Serial. Season 1 was downloaded more than 450 million times. They are mostly free, but I was not able to watch the HBO documentary about Syed's case since I don't have an HBO subscription. Now, I would like to summarize my takeaways from our class, Trial by Media. I really enjoyed the class as it was an excellent way to improve my critical thinking. I became aware of assumptions and biases versus facts. I will group my learnings into 4 topics. 1. The impact of media exposure on the courts and public. 2. New type of evidence and the role of social media. 3. Justice system differences and cultural issues. And 4. Some other key learnings. First, let me talk about the impact of media exposure on the courts and public. We learned that extensive pretrial publicity can have major implications on the trial outcome and the public's perceptions. It can create a jury bias that may impact the trial outcome. As we all know, the jury is selected from the public. Prolonged public exposure may expose the jury to some information that can have a damaging impact on the trial. For example, the Scott Peterson trial has been moved from Modesto County to another city due to the difficulty finding an impartial jury for a fair trial because of the extensive media exposure. Peterson's affair with Amber and his lies have been extensively covered by the media, including television interviews with Amber and Diane Sawyer and Scott Peterson on Good Morning America. Extensive pretrial coverage by the media can also put too much pressure on the police and prosecution to solve the case, resulting in poor decisions and wrong convictions. An excellent example was the West Memphis 3 case. The media made the public believe that the 3 children were killed as part of a satanic ritual. This created a massive fear in the public that Satanists were walking on their streets looking for children. Police and prosecution had to find some suspects and convict them to relieve the public from fear. Extensive pretrial coverage by the media can also develop public prejudice about the defendant or victim. If the public believes the defendant is guilty, but the jury acquits him or her, this may generate distrust in the justice system and create lynch mobs. An excellent example would be Casey Anthony. 3 years of media coverage formed a public opinion that Casey killed her daughter and went partying afterwards, showing no remorse. Her acquittal created outrage, and this created lynch mobs. For example, one of her attorneys was physically attacked in public. Another example is Amanda Knox. British and Italian people convicted Knox before the trial even began. This portrayed Knox as an evil, hypersexual girl who killed her roommate viciously during a sex game. We also looked into the issue of cameras in the courtroom. We all realize that cameras in the courtroom can provide transparency and build public trust in the justice system. It shows that we don't have trials in the Star Chamber. However, when they are in the courtroom, they can turn the courtroom into a drama show. We had several examples of this from the cases of Jodi Arias, O.J. Simpson, and Michael Jackson. They can intentionally cover and highlight only portions of the trial or the evidence they find interesting, important, or entertaining, which can mislead the public. Michael Jackson was a good example. Reporters who filled the courtroom were waiting for a statement from the accusers or the witnesses. As soon as they hear anything sensual or outrageous, they would run out of the courtroom to report and miss the rest of the testimony. After the case was over, according to Charles Thompson from the Huffington Post, comparing the court transcripts to the newspaper stories, the trial presented to the public didn't even resemble what went on in the courtroom because of the bias, distortion, and misinformation by the out-of-control media. When people who doubted their unanimous decision of not guilty, the jury replied, "They didn't even see what we saw." They can distract the participants, such as the defendant, prosecutors, defense, witnesses, and judges. We saw examples of this in the cases of Michael Jackson, Jodi Arias, and O.J. Simpson. They pay too much attention to themselves and miss important points. Jodi Arias was a great example. We also saw that post-trial media coverage can help in some cases. The media can start or continue covering the case after the trial to bring in new evidence to light. In the West Memphis 3 case, the falsely convicted teenagers were exonerated after 16 years because of the media's interest, leading to celebrity interest, which generated public interest. Frequent and biased coverage can also perpetuate the racial divide. One of the core media theories, cultivation theory, says that people who watch television frequently may overestimate the incidents in real life. So, for example, the extensive coverage of cases like the beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles in 1991, the suffocation of Eric Garner by an NYPD police officer in 2014, the fatal shooting of Michael Brown in 2014 in Ferguson, the death of Freddie Gray in the police van during his transport to the police station in Baltimore in 2015, may cause the public to perceive that the tension between blacks and the law enforcement is much higher than it actually is, hence promoting the racial divide. The next is the new type of evidence and the role of social media. We talked about e-evidence such as videos, voice recordings, text messages, and emails becoming common, and they can be used in criminal and civil cases under some circumstances if they are authentic and credible. Being impaired from drinking throughout the night, a 16-year-old young woman didn't realize that she was being sexually assaulted at parties by two young men, and her humiliating moments were being documented by bystanders using their smartphones in Steubenville, Ohio. These videos and text messages by bystanders were used as evidence in the trial. Also, a new type of online self-appointed detectives started to emerge. In the Steubenville case, Alexandria Goddard, a crime blogger who used to live in Steubenville, explored online sites and was determined to expose the crime even further. The Amanda Knox case showed us that the justice system can be unreliable in some parts of the world. While the prosecution and defense are treated equally in the United States, in Italy, the prosecution has too much power. Anybody slandering the prosecution can be jailed. This limits the freedom of the defense and prosecution and may manipulate the evidence. A really important thing I learned was how juries make decisions, or should make decisions. Juries need to base their verdicts only on the facts and not on emotions. The cases about Rodney King, Michael Jackson, and Casey Anthony were excellent examples of the jury paying attention to the facts and ignoring the bias created by the media. Also, the defense does not need to prove the innocence of the defendant. All it needs to do is to raise a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of the crime. The Casey Anthony case was an excellent example of this. The defense did not provide any evidence in the trial. The defense refuted each piece of evidence brought up by the state, for example, blaming the garbage left in the trunk for the smell resembling a decomposing body in the car, arguing that root banding was a novel and imperfect method to identify if the hair was coming from a decomposing body, and stating that the duct tape did not include any DNA, hence was most likely attached to the skull after decomposition of the body. This strategy helped the jury acquit Anthony. We also talked about jury bias, where the composition of a jury can create a biased jury which can impact the outcome of the trial. The Rodney King case had an all-white jury that acquitted the white police officers. In the Zimmerman case, there were 5 mothers in a 6-woman jury. The testimony of a young white mother, Olivia Bertalan, who was robbed by 2 black men in the same community a few months before the shooting, may have had an impact on those mothers who could see Zimmerman as a security guard protecting them from black intruders. Finally, character plays a certain role in the trials. First, it can be used as evidence. Although there is no judicially acceptable definition for courts to use as the admissibility of evidence, the character of the defendant can be used as evidence. For example, if a person has a trait of altruism, she is not likely to commit theft. It is important for a court to be careful with whether the character played a greater role in the defendant's actions than it truly did, or convict a defendant for the kind of person he is rather than for what he did. The Casey Anthony case is a good example. There is also character assassination, where some cases, with the hope to help the defendant, some people can be slandered such as Casey's father, accused of sexually molesting her when she was a child. The Adnan Syed case has some similarities and differences to some of these cases, with the post-trial coverage by Serial and other media helping Syed to grant a new trial. This was very similar to the West Memphis 3. Syed was helped by the media to grant a new trial. Also, similar to the West Memphis 3, the prosecution built their case based on their only suspect and disregarded relevant evidence. All evidence in Adnan's case was circumstantial. Other than his palm print on the map in Hayes' car, there is no physical evidence directly tying Syed to the crime. Hence, the verdict was based on circumstantial evidence. The cases of Casey Anthony, West Memphis 3, Scott Peterson, and Michael Jackson were similar in that sense. The issue of race and ethnicity played some role, but not as much as the cases of O.J., King, and Zimmerman. There were no cameras in the courtroom that can raise public interest during the pre-trial and trial. This may have helped Syed, as it could push the court to scrutinize the prosecution's evidence. This was similar to the West Memphis 3, but different than the cases of O.J. Zimmerman and Casey Anthony. In Adnan's case, defense was not able to raise a reasonable doubt by arguing the state's evidence and story. This was very different than the O.J. and Casey Anthony cases, especially in Casey Anthony where the defense did not have any evidence. The attorneys challenged every piece of the state's evidence. First, I would like to briefly go over the Adnan Syed case to help make some of my points regarding Adnan's guilt and future later. The victim, Hae Min Lee, was a 17-year-old honors student at Woodland High in Baltimore, Maryland. Her parents immigrated from South Korea. She disappeared on January 13, 1999, and her body was found in a park near Baltimore about a month later. Adnan Syed, Hae's ex-boyfriend, was found guilty of first-degree murder and received a life sentence. He was also an honors student and Hae's classmate. He was a Muslim, and his parents immigrated from Pakistan. The key witness for the state was Jay Wilds. Jay was a black 19-year-old young man who graduated from the same high school a year ago. He was dealing drugs out of his grandmother's home where he lived. He said he had helped Adnan bury Hae. Adnan knew him via Stephanie, Jay's girlfriend, who was also Adnan's friend. Others included in the case are Aisha, Hae's best friend, who testified that Adnan was obsessed with Hae. Asia, a classmate of Adnan who claims she saw Adnan at the library around the time Hae was killed. Nisha was a young lady in Silver Spring. Adnan started flirting with her after his breakup with Hae. The call to Nisha was a key evidence presented by the state. Jennifer was Jay's best friend. She helped Jay ditch the evidence. Kathy was Jennifer's sorority sister. Adnan was introduced to her in her place during the evening of Hae's disappearance. The fact that both Adnan and Jay were in her home together and the calls Adnan received at that time helped the state to put the story together. Don was Hae's new boyfriend and Stephanie was Jay's girlfriend, as I mentioned before. Here is the timeline of key events. Hae and Adnan break up on Christmas. They were dating since April 1st. Hae and Don started dating on New Year's Day. Adnan buys a new cell phone 2 days before Hae's disappearance. Hae goes missing on January 13th. Hae's body was found on February 9th in Leakin Park. Police interviewed Jen, Jay's best friend, on February 27th, and police arrested Adnan the next day. In order to provide some perspective, I would like to go over the location of some key places. This school is very close to Best Buy, which is less than a mile. The park Hae was buried in is about 3 miles from the school. The place Hae's car was found was very close to where Hae was buried. Also, the mall where Adnan and Jay dumped the evidence and Jen picked up Jay later is about 2 to 3 miles from the park. The reason I wanted to present this is when I listened to the podcast, the locations somehow felt far from each other, and I could not tell how quickly Adnan and Jay moved around in such a short amount of time. This map helped me visualize the events easier. Here is a story by the state. Jay's testimony confirms some parts of it, but not all of it. On the morning of January 13th, Adnan and Jay go to the mall to shop. Adnan leaves his car and cell phone with Jay so he can buy a gift for Stephanie, and Adnan can reach Jay later that day. Jay drops Adnan at school at midday and goes to Jen's to smoke weed. After the school is dismissed, Adnan asks for a ride home from Hay. He strangles her at the Best Buy parking lot. He calls Jay from a payphone in Best Buy and asks him to pick him up from there. When Jay arrives, Adnan pops open the trunk and shows Hay's body to Jay. They leave Hay's car with Hay's body in the trunk at a park and ride on I-70. They drive around in Adnan's car, smoke some weed, and Jay drops Adnan off at school for track practice. Although nobody remembers seeing him there, Adnan wanted to establish some alibi at the practice. Jay picks him up at around 6 p.m. and they both drive to Kathy's. Kathy does not know Adnan. Adnan receives 3 calls on his cell while they were there. One of them was a call from police asking about Hay. This call puts Jay, Adnan, and other witnesses in the same place and becomes a key part of the state's story. Adnan and Jay leave Kathy's around 6:30. They drive to Jay's home to pick up shovels. They both drive to Leakin Park and dig a hole. They pick up Hay's car from the parking ride and drive separately to Leakin Park. Jay refuses to help bury Hay. While he was waiting, Adnan buries Hay in the hole they dug together. Adnan dumps Hay's car in the neighborhood near the park while Jay follows him in Adnan's car. They both drive to Westview Mall and dump the evidence. Shovels, boots, etc. Adnan leaves Jay there. Jay calls Jen to pick them up. They wipe the shovels clean and Jen takes the remaining evidence to the dumpster the next day. On the other hand, Adnan literally does not remember anything that day that can help him. He doesn't remember that they went to the mall together. He switches his story about asking a ride from Hay. He does not remember seeing Asia at the library. He doesn't remember if he went to track practice, and he doesn't remember what he did the rest of that night. He says he would have gone to eat something so he can break his fast and smoke weed, and he would have gone to the mosque for prayers, but he had no alibi. One key evidence the state brought was a 2-minute call to Nisha, whom Jay does not know. Since the phone was supposed to be with Jay, this puts Adnan and Jay together in the afternoon, supporting Jay's story. Adnan refuses this as he thinks it must have been a butt dial, but Nisha testified and said that she spoke with both Adnan and Jay on the phone at that time. Another key evidence state presented was the 2 calls that pinged the cell phone tower near Lincoln Park at 7:09 and 7:15. This is consistent with Jay's story and puts Adnan at the burial site. He denies being there. The cell phone expert state brought to testify said the location identification using towers was legitimate. I think Adnan is guilty. I'm basing this on the following facts. While Adnan called Hay very frequently up until 12:05 a.m. on January 13th, he did not call Hay for the rest of the day at all. He purchased a new cell phone 2 days before the murder, meaning he was planning for this. He gave his car and cell phone to Jay on the day of the murder. Why would anyone do this? I don't buy the gift story. He doesn't remember some obvious details even after the police call. I understand people are not remembering things if they are ordinary, but a police call is such an important event. He should have remembered something. Jay and Adnan are not close friends. Suddenly they go to Kathy's home, a person who Adnan does not know. This also confirmed that they were together that evening. The cell phone log is legitimate, especially Leakin Park calls, and Jay's testimony describing the events that is consistent with the call log and the cell phone towers. Also, Adnan cannot counter most of Jay's testimony. He cannot say, no, this is not true, this is what I did at that time. He kept saying, I would have been doing this, I would be at this place. Adnan and Jay are just acquaintances, but they seem to spend the entire day together. Why would they do that on the exact day that Hay was murdered? Before I discuss what is next for Adnan, I would like to highlight some of the issues with the prosecution's timeline. The prosecution claimed that Hay was killed at 2:36, 21 minutes after school's dismissal, because there was an incoming call at 2:36 on the call log, and the state claimed that this was the "come and get me" call. Although Jay said repeatedly that Adnan called him around 3:40 or 3:45, the prosecution stuck with the 2:36 call. However, according to several witnesses, this was not possible. The last class was AP Psychology, and Adnan and Hay were in the class together. Aisha saw them, and she heard that Hay could not give a ride to Adnan. Hay also spoke with another student, Debbie, and told her she had to pick up her little cousin after school. Hay was a manager for the boys' wrestling team. There was a match that afternoon, and she was supposed to be with them on the school bus. A third student named Summer ran into Hay thinking that she was going to join them on the bus with the wrestling team. She said she would join them later. Hay was also seen by the lady who owns the concession stand when buying apple juice and hot fries. So there was no way for her to be strangled within 21 minutes after school. In addition, no one saw them together after leaving school. So there are several counter-arguments to the state's timeline, and Asia is willing to testify as an alibi. The current defense also plans to use the experts to challenge the cell phone tower location determination. Jay's story shifted substantially over time. Jay yet again changes his story. At the interview with The Intercept, he now says that the first time he saw Hay's body was not in front of Best Buy. It was in front of his grandmother's house. Although the prosecutor, Kevin Urich, in the past trial calls this collateral fact as opposed to material fact, that is something directly related to the questions of guilt or innocence, and it may be important in the new trial. Since Adnan's previous lawyer admitted that she missed a key witness like Asia and the fact that she was debarred for malpractice, this may help generate some sympathy from the jury. Also, Adnan's good character in prison may also be used as character evidence. Most importantly, now there is a lot of interest by the media, so everything will be highly scrutinized under the microscope with the media's attention. I think the defense this time will be able to raise a reasonable doubt in the jury's mind, leading to Adnan's acquittal. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention.